Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and on this episode I'm just going to do a quick rundown on my take on projectors versus TVs and what you should do. I would say had I done this video 3-4 years ago, I would just say you should definitely get a projector. It's the way to go. 10 years ago, projector. Today I think it's a little more complicated and it's worth discussing, but I would still say that for a lot of people they're going to tend to side towards projector versus a TV for a home theater. If we're talking about a dedicated or relatively dedicated, relatively light controlled room and where a large screen is desired. And that's because at the end of the day, the cost of a projector relative to screen size is still going to be your best value. So you can get a 100-inch to 150-inch screen at a relatively good price. In fact, if you go and do the kind of like Amazon special type stuff, you can get screens for a few $100s that are halfway decent. The projector itself, I mean, I personally find that $3,000 on up is sort of the price range for something that's decent, but there certainly are passable projectors that project an impressive image for under $3,000. In the $1,500 to $2,500 range, mostly what you're giving up is going to be some color accuracy, some sharpness, and really contrast. That's the biggest one. You're just not going to get the contrast that you get from better projectors. But when you move into the higher end Sonys and the higher end JVCs especially, you can get something that's going to offer better color, better sharpness, and then really significantly better black levels, and as a result better looking contrast. And those images tend to pop more when that's true, and they look better with HDR. The higher end projectors also just do a better job handling HDR images, and that's actually where we get back into the, well, why would you do a TV? So as I said, these projectors tend to support screens between 100 and 150 inches. 150 tends to be more the brighter projectors. Bigger than that, you're really talking about a much higher end projector. Most projectors, even $25,000 JVCs and Sonys, do not have the brightness to really do a good job with HDR material on something bigger than 150 inches. And that's the diagonal of a 16:9. When I say that, to be honest, we should be talking more in terms of width. And so going with that, you know, basically something between 80 and 120 inches is kind of the limit. Anything bigger than that from a width standpoint really needs a better projector. And that's where we're getting into probably $30,000, $40,000 on up. So that's where we can start to look at alternatives potentially for a number of reasons. So if you, for about, I actually don't know the price off the top of my head, I think it's around $12,000 to $15,000, you could get a 100-inch or close to 100-inch display. Sony and Samsung both have displays in that size range. They're not OLED, so it's not going to be perfect contrast. They are LED, but the image quality is really, really good. They are a lot brighter than projectors, and as a result of that, they have a couple of advantages. So one is, if we're talking about like a family room or a living room that isn't perfectly light controlled, or where you may be wanting to watch when it's light out, then one of the issues you're going to find with projectors is they just don't work very well. The black levels wash out significantly. They don't do a good job rejecting side light or overhead lights. I know people, my wife is this way, she just doesn't really like to watch a movie in a dark room. It's not her preference. She prefers to watch movies with the lights on. She will watch a movie in a dark room if she has to, but it's just if she had her druthers, we'd be sitting in a nice comfortable living room on a nice comfortable couch with the lights maybe dim but on, so she can see around her. She just doesn't like that feeling of being in a dark room. And in spaces like that, some sort of a direct radiating display, we'll call it, is really preferred. So you've got LCD TVs, you've got OLED that actually have gotten up into that 100-inch range. As we want to get bigger than that size, we run into an issue. So as I said, we can get those for about, I think somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000, maybe $17,000, $18,000. They do sales on these too sometimes, and you get some discounting. I sell the Sony and the Samsung ones. I've only sold one of the Sonys ever. It's just not a common request. A lot of guys that are into that market would actually prefer bigger yet, and they just go with projector. So that's what I tend to sell a lot of. But as I said, there's advantages to those TVs, and I do try to tell people, like, let me know what you're using this for so we can figure out what the best solution is. So why would you want to choose the others? Well, there's actually another type of display. It's related to these LED displays, but it's a different technology that allows you to go bigger yet. And traditionally, they had two problems. One was the picture quality wasn't quite good enough for really high-end cinema use. And the second was they were too expensive. And they still are very expensive, but they were like, we're talking well into the six figures expensive. And so they were out of reach for everybody. And those are what we refer to typically as micro LED displays, but there are various technologies that are used to create these. And these are modular often, and they can range in a lot of different sizes, but you can go and do a 100-inch one. I wouldn't. It's not a good use of that money because they are more expensive. But if you wanted a 150-inch, for instance, or 175-inch, these displays really, I think, do a better job reproducing HDR. So there are versions of them that can do perfect DCI-P3. There are not versions that can really do Rec 2020 100% yet, but they're getting closer and closer. And actually the technology and the chipsets needed for that, the LEDs, do exist. The issue is just getting these things fabricated at scale at an affordable price. So we're not quite there yet, but keep in mind, not a lot of projectors do DCI-P3 perfectly. Some do, but many do not. And none can do Rec 2020 with one exception, the Christie Eclipse. And so if you, I will say, at that price point, when you take the cost of the screen, the cost of the projector, and the cost of installing the projector, because the Christie Eclipse projector, it requires a lot of very specialized installation. You're probably at around the same price point of doing something that supports close to or possibly all of Rec 2020 with a micro LED display. So that could actually be an alternative option. The Christie projector still is going to be able to do, it's so bright you could do a massive screen. You could do a 300-inch screen. And it's got a number of advantages in that regard, including you can still use an acoustically transparent screen, which allows you to put the speakers in the ideal location, which is going to be behind the screen. With these direct display systems, you can't put the speakers behind. And so you have to start to do fancy things like creating basically phantom centers with a speaker above and below, or the reflectance approach where you're reflecting speakers off of the screen surface. That's actually not as simple as it sounds to do it in a convincing way. Or the other thing you could do is a different kind of, just the old-fashioned phantom image approach really, which is just a left and a right speaker on either side of the display, and you just hope for the best. All of these are compromises compared to the AT screen with the speakers behind it. So a projector advantage again is that, but if you're somebody who's not as into the sound per se, but you're super into the video quality and you want the best, the reality is you can get generally a better HDR image from the best of these displays. Let's take that Christie Eclipse out of the equation because that's an unusual projector. There is nothing cheaper that's even similar. It uses 6 DLP, basically the mirror chipsets, 3 of them for the colors, 3 of them essentially for like a contrast map. That approach is unique. There's no like cheaper Christie, there's no Barco, there's no Optima that does anything even close to that. So that is a unique product. Outside of that, all the other projectors on the market, in my opinion, are compromised in their ability to accurately reproduce HDR the way it was intended. I mean, when you're talking about the extreme end, which was 10,000 nits of peak brightness for specular highlights, there's nothing on the market that can do that. But projectors aren't even in the ballpark. They're like lucky to be doing 200 nits or 100 nits. So projectors are way off from that. And people say, well, that's so bright it would blind your eyes. Well, here's the reality. If you walk outside and you walk down the street on a sunny day, the sun is well beyond 10,000 nits, but the reflections of the sun off of the car, those little tiny streams of light that are coming off of a shiny car, for instance, are probably 10,000 nits. And they don't blind you per se. And that's part of the perception of reality that we get when we look around. So if what you're looking for is something that accurately reproduces the light dynamic range of the video signal in an HDR movie, projectors can't do that. And actually, most displays would come short. But the displays are going to be a lot closer, with a lot of them able to do 1,000 nits. They've now started to get close to 2,000 nits. And again, with some of the best micro LEDs, we're seeing upwards of that. So 2000 nits plus. And so I would say for people that are into that, that's actually a better approach. And those are getting to a point where the smaller ones are $30,000 to $50,000 on up. So still a lot of money, but they're no longer, like that one that was $30,000 used to be $100,000. The one today that's $100,000 used to be $500,000. So they're coming down in price. And the cheapest of them are actually starting to get to a price point where still wealthy, but more average wealthy people, let's say, can afford them. And then, as I said, there are 100-inch displays from Sony and Samsung. LG probably, I think they have something too, but I don't know what it is anymore. It might be an OLED, and I don't know what the price of it is. Anyway, the Sony and the Samsung ones at least are priced such that I think more average people can afford those in a more reasonable home theater. And so I would say, you know, you have to kind of make a decision there what you're trying to do. The light control issue is a big one. I mean, I have seen people, in fact, I did this. When I first got into this stuff and I first bought my first projector, I stuck the projector in just a normal living room. And I was renting, so there was no painting. So like we're talking white walls, white ceiling, off-white carpet. It was like a light gray couch. Everything in the room was light. The projection screen was, I think the company's out of business, Karada, I think it was, but it was a white material, matte white, you know, it was supposed to be like the best for quality. My light control was some curtains you could pull closed. They were not blackout curtains, like a little bit of light could pass through the material, but then all the edges and everything passed through. And my projector was a Yamaha that I don't remember the lumens. I think video optimized lumens where everything was correct was probably like 150 lumens, and I had a 100-inch screen. The image was awful. The brightness wasn't good, the picture quality wasn't good, and yet it was still really impressive compared to what I had been used to, which was like a 40-inch or something LCD display. Then I upgraded to what was at the time bottom-of-the-line Sony video projector, and all of a sudden I went from, like I said, I think it was like 150 or 200 lumens to like 300 or 400 lumens of video optimized, and it was a same 100-inch screen, and it was like way better. And then I bought a light rejecting screen at some point, which actually helped a lot. The contrast got better, but it wasn't quite as bright, so then the projector wasn't bright enough. So then I upgraded again to a better Sony that was like, let's say 500 lumens, and it was shocking. And then I got a JVC, it was like the RS1, and that was even better yet. And I actually just kept that for a really long time because the contrast was so much better, the brightness was so much better, that I really didn't feel the need to go better yet. The RS2 was better. I think I had seen those a few times. I never bought one. And then eventually I did upgrade to, I think it was next to top of the line or top of the line JVC a few years ago. So it's, 2 generations ago, I believe, at this point. And I've seen all the Sonys and all the JVC since then, and I know what they're like. And to me, it's just a very impressive image. And it's part of the experience is being immersed in that properly sized screen, which most TVs are not. And it's hard to do that in a family room. But back when I was doing this in not light-controlled spaces, the biggest problem I was finding was that the contrast was compromised, we'll say disproportionately, by the effects of this. In other words, like what seemed like a very tiny amount of light in the room was actually having a pretty major effect. And when I first built my dedicated theater with no windows back in our old house, and put the same projector and the same screen into that room, it was like night and day. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was just amazing how much better the image got. Everything popped more. And so today, I think looking back on that experience, I really think that people need to consider their use case. If you don't have a proper light-controlled room, I know that the projectors create a very impressive image, and I know they're a good value to get that large image. I do think that something like a 100-inch LED TV is probably a better option if you can get away with it. As I said, you're going to make some sound compromises because you can't do the AT screen. But I think in terms of just overall image quality, you're going to have a better experience. The last thing I'll just touch upon is size, and this isn't really an LED TV or a direct view TV versus projector type of discussion. It's true of both, but most people put displays in their rooms that are too small. And I think people hear people like me talk about 100-inch displays and they're like, that's crazy. I have a 65-inch and it's huge. Because these TVs have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, our perception is that they're huge, but that's not how you size a TV. It's not the view that the thing in the room is big compared to what it used to be. We've been watching on displays that were too small for a long time. So the science behind choosing a display is you want the image that you get from the movie to reflect your actual field of view or close to it. You don't want to exceed your field of view because you don't want to be in a position where you're having to look around while you're watching the movie. It's distracting, but you want it to be such that it generally reflects the field of view that you have. And what that allows for you is to be immersed in the movie as if you're there, because you're getting an experience as if you're there. And that's what commercial cinemas do. And the screens have gotten bigger, and actually in some cases like IMAX, they've intentionally slightly exceeded your field of view under the guise that you can stick stuff at the extreme ends of the screen that you're not really intended to see and pay attention to. It's more like movement, like somebody walking off screen. In real life, you would have somebody at the extreme ends where, yes, you can tell there's movement. It's not your direct focus, and so they've done that on purpose to kind of allow that, and then, yeah, you might move your head a little. At a typical sitting distance of 12 feet, we'll say, which is a pretty common one in a lot of living rooms, the size of screen that you probably need is going to be somewhere between, I'd say at the low end, 80 inches wide, and at the high end, maybe 120 inches wide. That's at 12 feet. At a lower, let's say at 8 feet, so a smaller room, we're talking wide, not diagonal, which is different than how TVs are typically sold. But that would be 100 inches to 150 inches is kind of the range of display sizes that makes sense at a 12-foot distance, depending on if you want to be at the low end of the field of view to the extreme, you kind of exceeded it, but it's okay. At an 8-foot distance, we're really not moving down a lot. Maybe we go to 85 or 90 inches up to 120 inches, something like that. So when you compare that to the typical TVs that people buy, most people are buying 55 to 65 inches, maybe 70, 75 inches. 85 is as big as a common affordable display gets. And so what I'm telling you is that 85-inch TV, which is the biggest affordable display you can get, really only works if you're sitting like 8 feet away. If you're sitting 12 feet away, it actually still is not the right level of immersion. You're not covering the right field of view to even come close to what you would get in a movie or what the director intended when they shot the movie. And so it's hard to see what's going on. If you get into even bigger rooms where you're sitting even farther back than 12 feet, like 15 feet, you need an even bigger display than 150 inches, going diagonal now. And so what that means, again, is there just aren't direct displays that are big enough to give you that level of immersion without going to the modular systems like the micro LEDs. And so you do want to make sure you're sizing things correctly for your intent. If the whole purpose is just to have this video image playing in the background, that, yeah, you can see what's happening to a point, you don't care about the immersive experience, you're not trying to get what the director intended, and the notion of taking up that much space on your wall is ridiculous, then don't worry about it and get the size that makes sense for you. But if you're watching my channel, I'm assuming you're into home theater. I'm assuming that what the director intended is something you care about. And if that's true, like I said, most people have displays that are too small, even for their basic living room systems. So that soundbar system or that basic 5.1 system. I mean, I've mentioned this before, in my family room, we have this marble wall feature we did with a fireplace on the bottom, like a linear wide fireplace. And the speaker system that's in that room is 5.1.2. So 2 overhead Atmos channels. There's no sidewalls really. There is on one side but not the other, so there's no side speakers. So there's rear speakers instead that are spaced widely apart, relatively speaking, and then the LCRs. And the TV I did was 77 inches only because I really wanted an OLED and I couldn't afford the 85 inch. I mean, even at dealer cost, that's a really expensive TV and I just couldn't afford it. Having said that, I think the moment that an 85 or 90 inch version becomes available for like $2,500 or $3,000, I will be putting that in. I will be replacing the one I have. It'll probably be old enough that that would make sense, and I'll be putting in something bigger because our distance to the screen is about, I'd have to measure it to be sure, but I think it is about 12 feet. And so that 77 inches doesn't provide sufficient immersion. And it really isn't that kind of like cinema experience that I typically get from a theater. So I think of that as actually a pretty decent setup overall. I think the cost, at least at retail, for everything in there is about $15,000. I think most people would say that the TV plus speakers plus receiver of $15,000 is nothing to sneeze at. It's not super high end, but it's not a cheap system. And I'm telling you that that experience though is not good, what I would call like a good fully immersive theater experience. And there's two things that system doesn't do well. From the display side, it's just too small. I mean, that OLED from Sony is a really good TV. The video quality is awesome. Contrast is amazing. The HDR images look great, but it's just too small at 77 inches. And the other thing it doesn't do quite as well as I'd like it to is the dynamic range of the system isn't great. So it's definitive technology, and while speakers, I actually think for the price, they're about as good as it gets, but the price is too low, basically. I would need to spend more money, and I'll be doing some things to try to improve that, but what I've noticed is it audibly compresses when you try to play even minus 20 of reference level, 20 decibels of reference level, you start to notice during extreme peaks compression. If you actually turn it all the way up to reference levels, the system definitely overloads and distorts. It cannot do it. And my guess is it's a number of things. One of them is actually the receiver. It's a Pioneer Elite receiver with Durac, so it's one of the new ones. And it's the lower end one though, and it's I think rated for like, with all the speakers going, about 80 watts. I haven't had a chance to measure it yet, but I bet you if you did an actual all channels driven the way I have it set up, so that would be 7 speakers powered by it, I bet we're not getting anywhere near 80 to 100 watts. I bet we're getting like 50 or 60 watts, and that's probably not enough. So probably I need to be separating out at a minimum the LCRs, if not the LCR and rear surrounds, onto their own amplifier. That would probably substantially, I'd probably get at least 3 or 4 decibels more output from it that way. And then the other upgrade would be a more efficient, higher output, higher power handling speaker. And unfortunately, instead of being $5.99 a piece, you know, I've looked into this a bit to see kind of like what's the next step up that would actually give sufficient, and I've gotten way off topic, I apologize, but the next step up would end up being probably spending more like $1,500 to $2,000 a piece at minimum, if not more. And so, you know, it's a lot of money. Video's kind of the same way, to get back on topic. You know, the 77 inch was what I chose because it was incrementally more expensive than the 65, but it was a good 12 inches larger. Going to 85 inches was not incrementally more expensive, so to get that not even 10-inch larger diagonal display was going to be, I think it was doubling the price or something. It was at least, I believe it was like another $2,000 or $3,000. It was a lot more expensive. And then to go up to 100 inches, it was like, I think for the OLED ones, they're $20,000 or $30,000. It's 10 times more expensive than I paid. It's just absurd. So, you know, you do have to kind of consider that. In my case, probably, somebody made a comment about this. I should do a video on it. Be happy with what you have. I probably should be happy with what I have. It is a really nice setup. It's enjoyable. It works really well. And I did everything at a price that I could afford to do. And I think everybody's in that position to some extent. Everybody has to make certain decisions that will compromise the performance of the system, but keeps it within a budget that makes sense for them. And in my case, that's what I did. I made certain choices. So, you know, going back to the video display choice of projector versus screen, you have to kind of pick a price point that makes sense. And then you have to look at, for the size screen that you need and want and can justify in the room, what's going to give you a better image, the LED or LCD display or the projector. So that's my take. I don't know if I gave you an exact answer or if I just gave you food for thought, but either way, hopefully it was helpful. And there's, like I said, more coming. Oh, and please subscribe to my channel. I think that that's a good way of staying on top of all the new information that I'm going to be bringing here. So thanks.